Everyone thinks their first love is unforgettable. Mine never even had a chance to end. He was a soldier. I was just a girl in a small French town. And what we had, it stayed with me my whole life. Today, I want to tell you about that summer, the glances, the letters, the silence when they stopped coming. It's a story I never thought I'd share. But maybe it's time someone else remembers it too. This is the story of James, and the love I carried quietly for 70 years. The war had ended, but its shadow lingered. The world was slowly rebuilding, piece by piece, but the scars were still fresh, etched into every face, every building. It was the kind of silence that fills every corner of your life, leaving you feeling empty, even when you're surrounded by people. I was 18 then. Young, yet already weighed down by a heaviness that seemed far too old for my age. I lived with my mother in a small flat above the local cafe. The cafe wasn't much, just a few tables, a counter, and the smell of strong coffee that seemed to permeate every inch of the place. It wasn't glamorous, but it was familiar, a place where life happened quietly, a far cry from the chaos of the war years, but still, the echoes of it were all around. I spent my days working there, serving coffee to the regulars who came in, old men who had seen too much, women with tired eyes who had lost husbands, sons, brothers. And then there were the new faces, the soldiers, some still in uniform, some wearing the remnants of a life that had once been. They came in, ordered coffee, sat in silence, as if the noise of the world outside was too much for them. I would stand at the counter, wiping down cups and listening to the conversations that were never fully spoken. The air was thick with unspoken grief, the kind that sits in your chest like a stone, waiting for something, anything, to shift. It was hard to describe, but it was there, in the way people spoke, in the way they looked at each other, and in the way they avoided talking about what they had lost. The world had moved on, but we hadn't, not really. My mother was always busy in the back, either cleaning or mending the few clothes we had. She rarely spoke of my father, not because she didn't miss him, but because it hurt too much. He had gone off to fight when I was just a little girl. I barely remembered his face, just the stories that my mother told me of how he used to hold me in his arms before he left. I think she told me those stories because it was the only way she could keep him alive in her mind. But I could feel it, too, that sense of loss. That gnawing ache. We had all lost so much, and nothing would ever feel the same again. One morning, when I was finishing my shift, the door to the cafe opened with a bell's familiar jingle. A group of soldiers entered, talking in low voices, some laughing, but it didn't reach their eyes. They seemed tired, like they hadn't slept in days, and yet they were here, as if they had no place to go. One of them stood apart from the group, and for some reason, my gaze locked onto him. He wasn't much older than me, maybe a few years. His uniform was slightly askew, like he'd thrown it on without care. His face was weathered, his eyes dark from exhaustion, but there was something about him, something in the way he carried himself. He didn't look like the others, who were either too guarded or too lost in their thoughts. He looked like someone who was still trying to figure out where he belonged in the world, in this world that had been so irreparably broken by the war. He caught my gaze as I wiped down the counter. For a moment, there was nothing else, just a silent exchange, no words, no noise. It was strange, that connection, fleeting yet undeniable. His eyes were tired, yes, but there was a quiet understanding in them, as if he too had felt the weight of the silence that had settled over us all. He walked up to the counter, and I handed him a cup of coffee. His fingers brushed mine as he took it, just for a second, but it felt like a touch that lingered longer than it should have. And just like that, I realized something. The world had changed, but perhaps there was still space for something else to begin. The days after that were a blur. He came back to the cafe a few more times. Each time, he would order his coffee in silence, and I would serve him the same way. Our eyes would meet every now and then, but neither of us ever spoke more than the bare minimum. There was an understanding between us that sometimes, silence was all we had left. And in that silence, there was something comforting. It was as if we didn't need words to share the weight of everything that had happened. We just knew. But then, one day, he didn't come back. A part of me had expected that soldiers came and went, just like everything else. And yet, that day, I felt that emptiness a little more than usual. And just like that, he was gone. But I didn't forget him. I don't think I could have. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the start of something that would linger with me for years to come. A quiet understanding. A fleeting connection. And in the years that followed, I would come to realize that sometimes, even in the silence, there are things we can never forget. His name was James. He was a soldier, a young man barely older than I was, with eyes that carried a sadness I couldn't quite understand. I remember the first time I saw him more clearly than any other moment. He was sitting at the corner table in the cafe, staring at his coffee as if it were a lifeline, but his gaze was far away, lost in something I could not reach. He looked out of place in the midst of all the soldiers who came and went. There was something about him that felt different, quieter. His uniform was still pristine, but there was a weariness about him, not the kind that comes from battle or fatigue, but the kind that comes from a deep, unresolved sorrow. I spoke to him when I was asked to deliver tea to the soldiers in the back room. As I set the cup on the table in front of him, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. It wasn't from cold, but from something deeper, something only he knew. "Thank you," he said, his voice low and soft, like the wind passing through the trees. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I felt something stir within me. There was something in his gaze, something familiar yet far away. A few days later, as I was walking down the street, I saw him again. This time, he wasn't in the cafe, but walking slowly along the cobbled streets, his head slightly bowed as if he were lost in thought. I made the mistake of not watching where I was going, and we collided. The shock of it made me drop the bag of groceries I was holding, and he quickly bent down to help me. "Sorry," he said, his voice tinged with the same soft, apologetic tone. He knelt down beside me, helping me pick up the fallen vegetables and bread. "No, it's my fault," I said, my face flushing as I tried to gather myself. He smiled slightly, the corners of his lips lifting, but there was a sadness in his smile. It wasn't a happy smile, but a resigned one, as if the world had taught him that happiness was too fleeting to hold on to. "You sure you're all right?" he asked, his voice gentle, the concern in his eyes clear. I nodded, unable to find the right words to say. There was something about him that made me feel safe, even if I didn't fully understand why. "Thank you," I said again, this time softer, my heart beating a little faster than before. From then on, we began to see each other more often. It wasn't anything dramatic, no grand gestures or sweeping declarations. He would stop by the cafe for coffee, and I would bring him tea or some small meal, just as I did for the other soldiers. But with James, it was different. Our exchanges were brief but meaningful, carried by the unsaid things that hung between us. There was one afternoon when he sat with me outside, near the edge of the garden, watching the world go by as I cleaned the table. He didn't speak much, he never did. But he didn't need to. His presence was enough. And I found that I was beginning to look forward to these small moments, these quiet spaces in time where we didn't need to say anything to understand each other. One day, as I was tending to a small cut on his hand, I noticed the letters in his pocket, bulging slightly. He never spoke about them, and I didn't ask. But I saw him glance at them sometimes, a shadow crossing his face whenever he did. The weight of those letters was heavy, even if he never read them out loud. "I'm sorry," he murmured as I wrapped the bandage around his hand, his eyes drifting away for a moment. "It's just hard sometimes." I nodded, not knowing what to say. He wasn't asking for comfort, just letting me know that he carried burdens I could never understand. Over time, we began to share more silences than words. Our meetings were simple, the occasional shared glance, a quiet smile, the soft clink of a cup being set down. But there was an unspoken connection, something that felt like it had been waiting for both of us. He never asked me anything personal, never sought to know more about my life, and I did the same. But in those brief exchanges, I came to realize something. In the midst of all the chaos, in the middle of this broken world, James had become someone I could rely on. His presence was like a quiet anchor in a storm that I hadn't even realized I was in. And maybe, just maybe, he had started to feel the same way. The city was slowly learning to breathe again, but it was still healing. The scars of the war were everywhere, in the cracks in the pavement, the empty windows, the silence that hung in the streets at night. But in small pockets of light, in the quiet corners, there was a sense of something else, a kind of quiet resilience. A slow rebuilding, not just of buildings, but of people. James and I began to build something too, not love, not yet. But something equally fragile, something I could cling to when the world outside felt too overwhelming. It started with small things, simple things. One day, when he stopped by to visit, I found him on the roof of the cafe, trying to fix a broken tile. It seemed like a small task, but the roof had been leaking for days, and we couldn't afford to hire anyone to fix it. "Need a hand?" I called up, half laughing, half awkward. He looked down at me, a bit surprised at the sound of my voice. "You're not afraid of heights?" he asked, his eyebrows raising. "I've worked in kitchens, climbed ladders to fetch the flour, cleaned the gutters," I said with a shrug. "Not much scares me anymore." He smiled, and for the first time, I saw the kind of smile that wasn't shadowed by sadness, the kind that hinted at something lighter. "All right, then. Come on up." So, up I went. We spent the afternoon on that roof, fixing tiles, catching glimpses of the city as it unfolded beneath us. We didn't speak much. The work was quiet, and so were we. But there was something about being there, side by side, that felt like enough. As if the work itself, the shared effort, was the conversation. That was how it was between us. Little things. Small gestures. When the sun began to dip lower in the sky, we moved down to the street, where children were playing with balls, running after each other in the dust. He paused, looking at them with a gentle smile, and I could see how the world had not quite stolen his innocence. He still saw joy in the small things, in things that most of us had forgotten how to notice. "I used to play like that," he said quietly. "Back home." I nodded, watching the children. "I think everyone here used to. It's just harder to remember, isn't it?" There was a pause. A long one. I didn't know if he had heard the sadness in my voice or if he was simply lost in the memory of something he no longer had. But he didn't respond with pity or sympathy. Instead, he simply offered a quiet, "You're right." Later that week, he asked me to help him with something else, the translation of signs around the city. There were so many new things, businesses reopening, old streets renaming themselves. I sat with him outside a small shop, the sun casting shadows on the cobblestones, as he pointed to the signs and I read out the words in broken English. He listened carefully, correcting me when I mispronounced a word. "You're getting better," he said, his eyes brightening for a moment. "You just need to relax." "Easy for you to say," I laughed, adjusting the piece of paper in front of me. But he didn't laugh with me this time. Instead, he just watched me, his eyes soft. He always did that, as if he was seeing something I didn't know was there. As the days passed, we started spending more time together. He would come by when he wasn't busy with the other soldiers, and I would show him the parts of the city I loved, the old library by the river, with its worn-out books and smell of forgotten pages. I took him to my secret spot, by the water where the world seemed a little quieter, a little safer. We didn't talk about the past. We didn't talk about the war. We didn't even talk much about the future. It was enough just to be there, together, in the now. One evening, as we sat beneath the shade of the old willow tree by the river, James took out a small, folded envelope from his jacket. He opened it carefully, like it was something fragile, and began reading from it softly. It was one of the letters he kept in his pocket. I didn't know from who, but I knew they were important to him. He read a few lines, his voice low and steady. Then, he stopped. A brief silence passed between us before he looked up at me, a faint smile on his lips. "Not all of it's for you," he said with a hint of teasing. I smiled back, feeling the warmth of the moment in a way I hadn't expected. "I don't need to know everything," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment, then laughed quietly. It was the first time I'd heard him laugh like that, free and unguarded. In the silence that followed, I realized something. We were two survivors, two people who had been hurt in ways we couldn't explain. And in some small, almost invisible way, we were beginning to heal each other. His presence was like a balm to the wounds I hadn't even known I had, and mine was to him. We didn't need words to understand that. We simply needed to be there. The local market had finally been restored. After months of effort, the streets were alive again. The small stalls selling fruits, vegetables, flowers, and handcrafted goods had returned, each corner of the square filled with color and laughter. The air smelled of freshly baked bread and roasted chestnuts, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the city seemed to breathe again. It was a celebration, a festival of sorts, the kind that hadn't happened in years. The kind where people allowed themselves to feel joy, even if only for a moment. The war was over, but it had left its marks everywhere. People had changed, but tonight, there was an unspoken understanding in the air. It was okay to smile again. It was okay to dance. I worked that evening in the cafe, but I could feel the excitement in the air. The hum of voices, the clinking of glasses, and the laughter of people who were finally allowed to enjoy life again. But it was also strange, the energy was almost too much, too fast, too loud. And in the middle of all that noise, I found myself thinking about the quiet moments I had shared with James. The stillness between us that spoke volumes without a single word. The night wore on, and when I finally finished my shift, I stepped outside to catch my breath. The street was quieter now. The market had closed, and the soft glow of lanterns still hung above the cobblestones, casting long shadows in the warm night air. I saw him then, leaning against the cafe's doorframe, waiting. He had a half-smile on his face, his eyes still carrying the weight of unspoken things. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at me, his gaze gentle. "Are you tired?" he asked softly. I shook my head. "No, just needed some air." He nodded, and without another word, we walked together through the empty streets. The world around us felt distant, muffled, as if it didn't exist in that moment. We didn't go anywhere in particular. We just walked. It was strange, but it felt like our own little world, a world we had created without even trying. Eventually, we reached the square, where the market had been earlier that evening. The wooden stalls had been packed away, and the cobblestones were bathed in the soft glow of the lanterns. The music from earlier had stopped, but the air still held that festival spirit, that feeling of life being reclaimed. Without thinking, I found myself moving toward the center of the square. James followed quietly, and as I turned, I saw him watching me, not with confusion, not with hesitation, but with something else. Something that made my heart beat a little faster. There was no music. But we danced anyway. It started with just the smallest of movements, a slow shift of weight from one foot to the other. Then, somehow, we were both moving, circling each other in the moonlight, our steps quiet but sure, like we'd been doing it for years. It was strange, and yet it felt so natural. Our bodies were close but not touching, moving in sync, the rhythm of our hearts more important than any sound around us. I could feel the cool night air against my skin, but all I could hear was the sound of his breathing, the soft shuffle of our feet on the cobblestones. There was no music, and yet, in that moment, it felt like we were dancing to the most beautiful song. I didn't know how long we danced. Time seemed to stretch and bend. The city had disappeared. There was only James and me, and the way the world felt just right in that fleeting moment. And then, without warning, we stopped. We were standing inches apart, and I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. His eyes were searching mine, as if looking for something he couldn't quite find but still wanted. He reached out slowly, and his fingers brushed mine. It was enough. It was everything. I didn't pull away. He leaned in, and our lips met. The kiss was soft, almost hesitant at first, as if neither of us was sure if we were ready for it. But then it deepened, and the world around us faded even more. It was a kiss that spoke of longing, of all the things we hadn't said to each other, all the words we hadn't found the courage to say. When we pulled apart, neither of us spoke for a long time. "I'll be leaving soon," he said quietly, his voice low, almost lost in the stillness of the night. I felt a pang in my chest, an ache I wasn't ready to face. "When?" "In a month," he replied, his gaze drifting away, as if he was trying to hide the sadness in his eyes. "The army's moving us. Back to England." My heart dropped. "England?" He nodded. "It's what I've known. It's home." I wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know how to explain the feeling that was rising inside me, the fear that twisted in my stomach. I didn't know how to ask him to stay. He reached out, his hand gently touching my cheek. "I'll write," he promised, his voice steady. Every letter, every word. You'll hear from me. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to trust that the letters would come, that we would somehow keep this connection alive despite the miles between us. But deep down, I knew the truth. The war had torn us apart once. And now, something else, something even more fragile, was about to break. But in that moment, I didn't want to think about the future. I just wanted to be here, with him, in this moment. I wanted to remember the way his lips had felt against mine, the way he had held me, even for just a second, as though nothing else in the world mattered. We stood there in silence, the night wrapping itself around us like a blanket. And for a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the promise of a letter, of words written on paper, could be enough. But deep down, I knew that the world was always moving forward, and that nothing would ever be the same again. James left. The morning he boarded the train to England, I stood at the station, watching the steam rise from the engine, my heart sinking with every passing second. He turned once before stepping onto the train, and our eyes met, a silent promise between us, one that I desperately clung to. I waved, and he waved back. It was all I could do. In the days that followed, life settled into a routine, but it wasn't the same. The cafe, the market, the streets, all of it felt quieter, more distant. But there was always the hope of the letters. James had promised to write, and I held on to that promise like a lifeline. At first, the letters came just as he had said. Every week, without fail, a new envelope arrived in the mail, his handwriting still as familiar as the day we had met. Each letter felt like a piece of him, a reminder that we weren't so far apart, that the space between us could be bridged with words. His letters were full of stories about England, about the people he had met, about his return to civilian life. But they were also full of promises. He spoke of the future, of a life together, a life that I had always imagined, but now, it was real in his words. "I'll be back, Sophie," he wrote in the first letter. "It's only a matter of time. And when I come back, we'll make a home. Together." And so, I lived with that hope, the dream of his return. I would read his letters over and over again, tracing the words with my fingers, imagining his voice as I read them aloud in my mind. Every letter, every word, filled me with a warmth that carried me through the days. But then, after 2 months, something changed. The letters stopped coming. At first, I thought maybe he was busy, that something had delayed his writing. It was strange, but not impossible. I told myself I'd hear from him soon. But as the weeks went on and the mailbox remained empty, the hope I had so carefully built began to crack. I waited. I waited with the kind of patience that comes from love and also from fear. I wrote to him, of course. I wrote every week, just as I had before, even though I didn't receive anything in return. My letters were filled with love, with words of longing, of wanting him to come back. But there was no reply. The silence stretched on. Each day, my hope dwindled just a little more. I could no longer tell myself that it was only a delay, only a matter of time. The silence was becoming its own story, one I couldn't ignore. I couldn't stop myself from checking the mail every day, hoping for a letter that would never come. I began to question everything. Had he truly meant all those words? Was it just a dream? Did he forget about me? Was he alive? Was he with someone else? The questions piled up in my mind, but the answers never came. Months turned into years, and the mailbox stayed empty. And still, I kept writing. I wrote letters I knew would never reach him. I wrote to a man I could no longer be certain even remembered my name. But I couldn't stop. The words felt like the only thing that kept him with me, the only way I could keep my love for him alive. So I wrote, week after week, pouring my heart into each letter, each sentence, even when there was no one to receive it. And though the years went by, and life moved forward, I never stopped. I never stopped hoping, never stopped waiting, never stopped loving him. There would be no reunion. There would be no return. There would be no answers. But in my heart, James was still there. His memory, the letters that never stopped arriving in my mind, would stay with me until my last breath. In the silence that followed, I had learned a painful truth. Love can survive, even when the letters stop. Even when the person you love is lost to you forever. And that was all I had left. As the years passed, I tried to live. I did what people expected. I moved on, just like everyone else. Life didn't stop for me, and it didn't stop for anyone. I met someone. His name was Thomas. He was kind, steady, a good man. We married when I was still young, and we built a life together, just like people do. We had children, a little house, and the world carried on. I loved him, of course, and I thought, at the time, that love was a simple thing. You meet someone, you share a life, you grow old together. That's how it goes. But, you see, it wasn't the same. I loved Thomas deeply, truly, but it was different. It wasn't the kind of love that made your heart race, the kind that makes your hands shake when you hear their name. It was the love you feel for someone you've known for a long time, someone you trust, someone who's there when you need them. It's quiet, comfortable, safe. And no one, not even Thomas, knew about James. It wasn't that I wanted to forget him. I could never forget him. He was a part of me, even if I never spoke his name aloud. The letters stopped, but the love didn't go away. It lived quietly, tucked away in a part of my heart I kept hidden. I kept the box, the one with the letters, the one with the photograph of him. I didn't show it to anyone. I didn't need to. It was enough for me to know that it was there, that I could look at it whenever I needed to. The photograph of James stayed in that box, never framed, never shown to anyone. It was just a small, black and white picture of him in uniform. His eyes, still so young and full of hope. The soldier with kind eyes. He looked like he was smiling, a faint, almost secret smile, and I often wondered if that smile was for me, or if it was just for the world. I never told anyone about him. Not even Thomas. I didn't need to. The love I had for James was something that existed in a world of its own, a place where no one else could touch it. It wasn't unfinished, it wasn't incomplete. It was just enough. Enough to carry with me. And when I felt like I needed to remember, I would open that box and sit in silence, just me and James, as if we had never been apart. Over time, I learned that love isn't always about grand gestures, and it doesn't always have to be shared with the world. Some loves are quiet. They're private, just between two people, and they live in the spaces that no one else can see. I never stopped loving him. He was part of my past, yes, but he was also part of my present. The quiet kind of love that doesn't demand attention or recognition, but that stays with you, in the small moments, in the quiet corners of your life. And that was enough for me.